So this video is long overdue, but it is the build of the desks that we now work on. As you can see, the desks we had when we moved into the house either didn't fit the desk stand we had or were very frayed at the edges. So we've replaced them with these, and this video is all about showing how we built them. When we moved into our house earlier this year, our grass was delivered on these pallets, which I was thankfully able to keep. I'm not sure I was allowed to keep them technically, but I did. And I broke them down to get all this wood, and we were also given a wardrobe, which I was able to break down and use the wood. So I could take a lot of measurements once I'd broken the pallets down, and from there I could start figuring out how I was going to build the desks themselves. So from the pallet, I knew I was going to get 3 or 4 of these long, thicker pieces of wood that sort of formed the runners of the pallet, and I was also going to get out lots of these different tiles. That's what I'm calling them, these sort of little planks of wood from the top. So with all that material, I could take one of the sheets, which was basically the side of one of these old wardrobes that I took apart. As the base of the desk, I could fix the thicker, longer pieces of wood from the pallet to the edges of that to form a sort of edging, and then I could tile on top with the planks of wood from the pallet. The first thing I did is to transfer the measurement of the final desk width onto the sheet that's going to form the bases of the desk, and I could then take my homemade track saw, push that up against this line, and then I can run the circular saw across it, and that's going to give me hopefully a perfect cut for the width that I need the desk to be. As you can see, that ended up being more accurate than I actually hoped it would be, so that was a good result. And what I'm doing here is taking some of those planks that I cut out of the pallet, and I'm trying to get them to be approximately the correct width. Obviously, if I had my table saw at this point, I would have used the table saw sled and done some sort of stop block system to make sure they were actually the same length, but this was sort of the best solution I could find at the time, so I tried pinning them all down under the track saw and then running that through, and it didn't work amazingly, but it got me roughly in the right ballpark of planks that were of similar length. So yeah, I mean, if you have to find a similar solution, you could try this. You probably do a better job than I did. You can see here that this did not result in pieces being cut to what anyone would refer to as machine accuracy in terms of the consistency of length, but regardless, we're going to call this desk rustic anyway, so it doesn't matter. What I'm doing here is I am taking the planks and I am just trying to plane down the surfaces to get them to be nicer wood, because they were that sort of horrible, fluffy, grain poking out sort of thing. So yeah, I'm taking the planer. I've only got it on like a 1 or 1/2 mil setting, and each time I'm just taking a little bit off just to reveal the nice wood that's underneath. Now, given the other method I tried of getting boards to be the same length didn't really work, I basically taped a bunch of them together to try a new method, and I took the planer to these to try and make them similar length. It ended up tearing out the end of the board that you can see here, but I think it resulted in the boards being a better consistency in terms of length than using the track saw, so I stuck with that for the remainder of this build. This obviously still wasn't perfect. You can see from this shot here just how inconsistent the boards still were, but there's going to be a solution to any gaps that exist in the tiling that is done. So these boards don't need to be jointed perfectly. That's why I wasn't fussed too much about achieving perfectly square edges and perfectly consistent lengths. In the background there, I have scuff sanded the base of the desk, and I've then applied No More Nails adhesive to it, which I'm going to use to stick the tiles on. And with that done, I can put the track saw on all the edges and trim off any overhang that exists. I then finished it off with a flush trim bit in the router, and where that finally left some little fuzzy bits, you'll see in a second, I just use a hand file to knock those down. Finally, for this desk, this is desk 1 by the way in the video. I'm going to build another one in a second that's done using herringbone pattern. I stuck the sides on, just again No More Nails, couple of screws and some clamps, scraped off any excess glue or adhesive that came out, and then drove in some screws for the sides because my clamps weren't long enough actually to clamp that bit. This didn't work very well at all, but I've seen many people before take sawdust and mix it with glue and use that to fill any gaps that existed. I mean, it did a fine job, but I have found another solution which comes later in the video, but I think the problem I had was that the sawdust I used was too thick. It was more chips than dust, so yeah, for your own reference, if you're thinking of doing that, make sure it's dust that you're using, not chips. Anyway, I sanded it down, rounded over all the corners, again just using the hand router, and at that point, desk number 1 was done and ready to be finished, or so I thought, because it turns out I had built it too small to fit over the arms of my desk stand, so I had to saw and manually chisel out these little holes for it to sit over the frame of my desk stand, but that's fine, you're not going to see it, it's going to be behind a desk stand that I build. That'll be another video, but yeah, here it is on the stand. You can see here what I'm talking about in terms of the back sticking out a little bit, but it's a far better solution than what I had previously. And this is, I'm going to race through this. This is building desk number 2 in the herringbone pattern. The steps to do the star are all the same, so I won't bore you with that, but yeah, here I am laying out the pattern for that. So with everything planed down, just as I did with the previous desk, I put it back into place and I fixed it with no more nails again. It was a bit of a nightmare to clamp up. I actually ran out of clamps, but in the midst of all this chaos, there's some clamping pressure being applied. So yeah, that is working. And again, I just put the track saw guide on the edges and ran that through to trim the edges off. Same process as the previous desk then. I took the electric hand plane and set it to 1/2 mil and just took off the really high spots first before taking the belt sander and then eventually the random orbital sander to it to finish it off. I didn't show this for the previous desk, but I sunk the screws in quite far and drilled a 8mm hole which I could then put a dowel into. So all I'm doing here is plugging that screw with a dowel, and then eventually once that dried I can come back and saw that off with a flush trim saw. Now, if you remember earlier, I said that it didn't really matter that the tiles weren't perfectly going to joint up, and that's because I intended to come back and use wood filler to fill any gaps that existed, and you can see I've done that here. I didn't film it, but hopefully you can see on the brick tiled desk there's a brown wood filler, and on the herringbone style one there's this white wood filler that I've used. And I think the effect came out really nicely. I'll show you at the end of the video that once I moved them inside they dried out a little bit, and I've got some cracking, so I'll just need to refill it, but I think it made the whole appearance a lot neater. So that's both desks done, and it's a massive improvement over what we had when we first moved into the house. If I come in close here, you're going to see the cracking I was talking about, but that's going to fill and sand out, so it's not going to be a problem at all. If there's anything you were confused about in this video or want me to clarify, just drop it in the comments and I will do my best to reply.